It's the internet. You're busy. Let's do this. Jeff Grubb with GamesBeat.com, and it's very late. I just finished writing my review for the Nvidia RTX 2080 Ti and the 2080. This is the 2080 right here. I have the Ti downstairs inside of a machine because I was taking some photos of it. So this one I've had this open before. Just gonna get it out of here. This is the review. We're gonna talk about these cards. We're gonna talk about Nvidia, and we're gonna talk about RTX and history. And I'm gonna do a history lesson that I just kind of learned. Bear with me. It's late. So, oh man, that crunching's got to sound really good on the mic. Let me just get this out of here real quick. Oh yeah. That's a good just audio soundscape for y'all. So here's a prop. I mean, it's a real thing, but I'm just, for this video, doesn't serve much more of a purpose than it's a prop. This is the 2080 RTX card. These cards, I think they're impressive in some ways, and they are very confusing in others. It's less confusing when you really look at what Nvidia is trying to do, but that isn't your job. It's Nvidia's job to explain why what it's doing matters to you. I think what they're really doing here is they are faking it until they make it. I'll explain that, but first let's kind of go over some basics. So the 2080 Ti is coming out next week, I think. The 2080 is coming out this week. I could have that mixed up. They're shipping this month. The 2080 Ti is $1,200. It's going to be $1,000 someday. This one is $800 and will be $700 someday. What that means... What it means right now is you got to pay $1,200 or $800, and the 2070 isn't out yet. It's not coming out yet. It's not for sale yet. That's coming maybe early next year. Who knows? The big selling point of these cards is that they are RTX. That means they are ray tracing cards. Ray tracing is it's a 50-year-old concept. It's a 50-year-old computer science idea where you... The simple way of putting it, it's physically understanding the way light moves in an environment and bouncing it off surfaces and how it reflects from one surface to another and then hits your eye and what it looks like after that single beam of light has done all that stuff. It's not, I mean, how it works is not super important. The point is that it's very computationally intensive, and Nvidia has used a combination of dedicated cores in the graphics card and algorithms and smart software partnerships with Microsoft and Unity and Unreal to make it work on these cards. But it's not in a lot of games. It's in no games right now as I'm telling this to you. I've had these cards since Thursday. Looked around, asked around, hey, isn't Shadow of the Tomb Raider out? I don't see an option for ray tracing in there. Guess what? It's not in there yet. We're waiting for an update. So what the hell? What's the point of any of this? Well, we'll get into that. There is still some value in talking about these cards because, well, I think the idea of having these cards in my hands and having no real world games that work with ray tracing or some of the other features like deep learning super sampling or DLSS, that's indicative and illustrative, one of those words, of the state of RTX and like the position that Nvidia is in at the moment. It is somewhat poetic that these cards that support ray tracing have no games to work with at the moment, because that is going to be the position they hold in the market for quite some time. There will be games that support it. There's going to be a list of games. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Metro Exodus. There's more than that, but these games are coming and they will support ray tracing. And it'll look nice, and it might hurt some performance, but it might not. It might be good enough, and it might look real pretty. Down the line, it's probably that's probably when it's going to matter, is down the line for us, for you and me, for people that just kind of play games. Ray tracing really matters because it's going to make games cheaper to make. It will make games simpler to make eventually down the line for them as well, for developers. In the meantime, you're going to have to, for developers that are making games today, they will have to continue using existing methods that work on consoles and graphics cards that have been around for a while now. And if they want to implement ray tracing on top of that, they can. So they'll have to do both. Ray tracing is pretty simple to implement. That's one of the reasons the developers want it so intensely, is because it is simple to implement. But still, the point is you'll have to do both for quite some time. So where does that leave these cards? Well, you know where it leaves them. It leaves Nvidia in a very familiar position. This is something that Nvidia has gone through before. In 1999, Nvidia released the GeForce 256, the 256, whatever. It's a card I never owned. I didn't have enough money to play to build a PC back then, and I was just a kid. I was still in high school. I was mostly playing Zelda on Nintendo 64 at that time. But if you look back at the history of graphics, computer graphics, the GeForce 256 was a pretty important moment. It was a card that came out, and it had T and L computing, basically. And it was hardware T and L, so that's transform and light, or transform clipping and light. Basically, this was just a way of taking a 3D space and understanding it in a way that it made it easy to present that 3D space on a 2D display. It existed for a long time before this, but it was done on the software side, which meant it was processed by the CPU. When Nvidia launched the GeForce 256, which I think was the first GeForce, it created hardware-dedicated T&L cores inside of that processor. This didn't make a lot of sense at the time. It would require developers to build specifically for hardware T&L. This would require different APIs, and the APIs that Nvidia had were buggy, and it was a problem, and it just didn't. And everyone was like, "This is unnecessary because CPUs are going to continue to be fast enough to support software T&L." And that was true to an extent, except for CPUs kind of got almost too fast. I don't quite understand. I'm not an expert, but what happened quickly was by 2000. If you didn't have hardware T&L, games started to look pretty rough, and the graphics card makers like 3DFX and Voodoo, it might be the same company, I can't remember, they didn't have hardware T&L, and they were getting left behind, and they were never going to catch up again, and those companies were going to evaporate. And the only other company that was going to be left, other than Nvidia, was ATI, now AMD, because they also had hardware T&L. By 2001-ish, I think every card on the market had hardware T&L. So it was a quick transition, 2 years. At the time, though, the critics were right, and then they very quickly looked like they didn't have the vision that Nvidia had. And it worked out for them, and it changed gaming and computer graphics for the better in the long term. And the GeForce 256 is fondly remembered at this point, even though at the time it seemed unnecessary, people didn't want it. It was more expensive than other cards on the market. It was often not that much faster than other cards on the market because of the way that, if you had a fast CPU, software T&L was kind of better in a lot of games. But that card is fondly remembered now because it lasted forever. Because it took so long for the industry to sort of shift to this other way of making games that it was supported into like 2006. I think was the last year a game came out that supported that card officially. And more importantly, it served as a really huge stepping stone for the GeForce brand, and the GeForce Series 2 came out and was a huge success. That was a huge hit. It was a big explosion for Nvidia in terms of its importance to computer components. That is a long history lesson to say that I think that Nvidia is trying to replicate what happened there once again. We're in a situation where gaming graphics have sort of reached a plateau. You can really push hardware if you want to do 4K. You can kind of push hardware if you want to do 144 hertz refresh rate, 144 frames per second. If you are just on a 1080p 60 monitor, though, really modest hardware is going to get you that, is going to meet that standard on ultra settings in most games. In my written review, I point to Doom 2016 as an example of games probably don't need to get much better than this in terms of visuals. They will, and I will be as happy as anyone else when they do, but they don't need to. Not really. At least not at 1080p 60 and with, just how good they look on ultra settings running on most modern machines. But that puts Nvidia in a weird position where, if most people are stuck at 1080p 60 and the only reason they would want to upgrade is if they go out and buy a new monitor, that's not great for Nvidia. They don't want to be held hostage to people waiting to purchase a new monitor. Monitor technology is finicky and weird, and there's a lot of distractions and I'm trying to think of the word, not gizmos, gimmicks. There's a lot of gimmicks in monitors, and Nvidia doesn't want to try to figure out that what people are going to do when it comes to monitors. And people don't upgrade their monitors frequently. Once every 5 years, maybe some longer than that. Like TVs are once every 7 years. Monitors are probably pretty similar. So Nvidia doesn't want to be associated with okay, we have to wait for people to go out and buy a 4K monitor, and then they'll realize why they need a new generation of graphics cards. Nvidia wants to put the impetus in the games themselves. It wants to drive people towards a paradigm shift, because there's something in the games that if I turn this on, it's going to look better, more realistic, and dynamic and beautiful, just with the flip of a switch. And it's in the games, and if I had a better card to run that specific feature, my games would be better, and I would really like that. That's what Nvidia wants. So that's where ray tracing comes in, and that's where the paradigm shift of trying to replicate the GeForce 256 is coming in right now. So that brings us to the cards themselves. Right now, we're in the beginning of that doubtful, cynical period where we're looking around saying these cards don't make sense. There's nothing to use them with. They're expensive, and their performance gains over the last generation aren't necessarily in line with what you would expect from an Nvidia generation-on-generation gap. In some ways it is, in some ways it's not. It's kind of all over the place when it comes to that stuff, and I'll try to bring up my my benchmarks here real soon. If I know I'll try to put a thing in the description that just jump to the benchmarks, because I'm rambling, but I think a lot of this is important. So Nvidia has these cards that don't make a lot of sense. So what is it doing? It is faking it. It is pretending that this stuff matters right now, because it thinks that it will make it and get to a point where it does matter. To me, it's important that the people watching this video and reading my review understand that Nvidia is indeed faking it now. They are. Ray tracing is not a thing. It's just not right now. It's not a thing. And maybe who knows, but I might wake up tomorrow and the Shadow of the Tomb Raider update might come out, and I'll play it, and it'll just be so mind-blowing that I have to come back and do another video and write more and say, it is a thing, and it matters, and every game needs this. I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. But ray tracing does feel inevitable in the same way that hardware TNL was. And if that's the case, Nvidia just needs to do a little dance for a little bit and provide enough of a leap forward that, sure, we're going to pay a little bit more now, but that's just going to usher in the next generation of RTX cards even faster, and these cards will probably be supported for quite some time while developers get caught up. And it's going to be they're faking it, but they're going to make it. It's Nvidia, and they've done this before, and they're following that playbook. And if they falter, I mean, it'll be bad. It'll be real bad. And so in my review, when I say I think that they will make it, I would bet that they would. I just wouldn't bet your money. So let's get to the benchmarks. I rambled there. There's some points worthy of consideration in there, I'm sure, and a lot of horse shit as well. Let's take a look here. So this is my write-up. You don't have to read all of this. If you want to, it's on gamesbeat.com. I just kind of wanted to go over some of the things that I did. Here's the basics. Like I said, I tested a 2080 Ti, a 2080, a 1080 Ti, and a Vega 64. I went with the Vega 64 instead of the GTX 1080 because I didn't have one handy. And I wanted to have an AMD perspective. And since the Vega 64 is pretty close, it's roughly close to a 1080, I thought it was a pretty good stand-in. I also tested, I tested 7 games, both in 4K and 1440p. The problem, though, with 1440p is that it's, the 2080 Ti is so powerful that even with a i7 8086K, it was still, the CPU was often the bottleneck. Not often, but often enough that it would have skewed the results. So the 4K results are they're much more representational of the power difference between the 2080 Ti and the rest. I do think that 1 or 2 games might have had like 1% CPU bottleneck, which is not great. I'll probably run through this battery test, this battery of tests again, but I think for now, I think this is pretty good, and it does show like there's a huge gap between the 2080 Ti and the 1080 Ti in my results, at least. It's massive. I don't think that's going to be consistent across every set of benchmarks that you look at, but in the 7 games I tested, which to be fair were all DirectX games, it's just a huge difference. So, wrong button there. Let's get into. So here's my bench, or my test bench here. It's an Intel i7 8086K. There's an all-in-one cooler on there. There's 32 gigabytes of 3200 megahertz memory from HyperX. The games are stored on a SATA SSD. The motherboard is an NZXT N7, and there's a 650 watt NZXT power supply. The 7 games that I tested: Grand Theft Auto 5, Hitman, the DirectX 11 version, Final Fantasy 15, the benchmark tool, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I believe that was also DirectX 11, The Division, also DirectX 11, and Monster Hunter World. So here's just like the basic results. This is the average frames per second across all 7 games. So this is just the entire test boiled down to a single number to kind of give you a general idea of how much more powerful the 1080 or the 2080 Ti and the 1080 are than previous generations. So you could see that the 2080 Ti really does sort of blow everything out of the water. But the 2080 is also significantly more powerful than the 1080 Ti. Let me scroll down here. Kind of just there are some numbers in here. So the 2080 Ti is 42% faster than the 1080 Ti. And then, but if you go to the 2080, it is only 16% faster than the 1080 Ti, and I think that comparison's worth considering, just because of like where the prices line up. Those two are they should cost the same in the end. Right now, the 2080 is more expensive though, and it's only 16% faster. That's maybe a problem, I think, because I think if you are comparing price to price across generation of NVIDIA cards, you would expect something more in line with 25%, the jump from generation to generation, and that's not happening here. The 2080 Ti to the 1080 Ti it is. And even, you know, like here, let's scroll down a little bit. So like Final Fantasy has a benchmark page where a lot of the tests are public. And you can see that the 2080 Ti is actually about, let's see, whatever right here, 22%, 23% faster than a Titan XP. So that's really good. That's really impressive. That's what you would expect. This test or this benchmark is not going to be super precise. It's one game. I would expect wider results, you know, overall from a variety of other games. But that gives you an idea of just where the 2080 Ti stands in relationship compared to the 2080, which is not quite having that same leap in performance. We can go through some of the stuff game by game here. So let me kind of make sure this is lined up. So it's gonna just kind of auto scroll through everything. You know what? No, let's just go at our own pace here. So here's Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So again, we're focusing on the 4K because the 1440p test, I did them. It really, you know, the number was pretty astronomical. But I would expect the 4K results to be more accurate in terms of representing the power difference. Let's see here. So Shadow of the Tomb Raider is, you know, you're hitting 60 frames per second on average. It is going to bounce up and down through there. You know, it is an average, but this is on kind of ultra settings. It's just as high as it goes. You would turn a lot of this stuff down just to make sure that you do get that more solid frame rate above 60 frames per second. Or if you're using a G-Sync, this is actually kind of right where you want to be. And at 4K to get this kind of performance on a game that is as pretty as Shadow of the Tomb Raider and as you know, as new as it is, that's really solid. That's really good stuff. Like for me, that I might not turn down the settings too much because if I'm playing on a 4K G-Sync monitor, there's not much to do because it's not like jumping out of the G-Sync zone. It's not going to fall down to the 20s. It wasn't doing that. So that's really impressive. Now, The Division is the one that actually surprised me the most. This is a pretty tough benchmark. There's a lot going on in this one. They throw a lot of stuff at the GPU and the CPU, honestly. And the 2080 Ti just handled it with no problem. You could see that the Vega 64 and the 1080 Ti actually do pretty decently. They're pretty solid as well. In the 40s. But to just get that huge jump into the 70s for the 2080 Ti is really impressive. And there's actually, here's a graph of the frame rate per second over 85 seconds for the Division. Make sure that's lined up. And you can see that it stays over 60 frames per second almost all the way throughout. Now there's a part at the end of the benchmark test for the Division where the camera sort of goes through some smoke and there's some explosions happening, and that part is pretty CPU intensive. And I tried to eliminate that as best I could just by really going nuts with the settings as best I could. But this is it still was that's the part that just like always makes the frame rate drop no matter how you test it. So you're still going to have that gap there. But when it's when it's GPU bound, we are staying well above 60 frames per second all the way throughout. That's really cool to see. It's really nice to see. It's like, okay, 4K gaming on the PC is still in a precarious position, but with the 2080 Ti, it does feel like, okay, no, we're here. It could happen. And it could be really smooth with just awesome visuals and 60 frames per second. If you want faster than 60 frames per second, you're not going to be playing 4K anyhow. But if you do want to go 4K, it is absolutely an option. Kind of go through some of these other games a little bit more quickly. The Final Fantasy 15 tool, it's pretty useful. You can see that it's definitely it definitely favors Nvidia, I would say, over AMD. The Vega 64 really struggled with it. It is, Final Fantasy 15 is a GameWorks game. There's a lot of Nvidia licensing or emblems and insignias all over that game. And it shows in the results of the benchmark tool. This is a game where, you know, again, you can like look at you can see how everything else compares. The 2080 Ti does handle it on high settings really well. But you can see just how much better it is than everything else on this list. You know, it's, you know, quite a bit better than a Titan V, Quadro P5500 SP. Like, these things are just, nothing is coming close to the 2080 Ti. And, you know, you go to a 1080, you know, this is a very popular card. You can see it's getting, you know, in that range where it's almost double the performance. Again, this is not the most accurate measurement tool right here, just going to the Final Fantasy benchmark page, but I do think it illustrates the power. Here's Grand Theft Auto 5. This is a game where you can really crank up the settings, and I did that. There is no like ultra preset. We just went in and we just cranked up everything, except for it was on 4X, MSAA, and FXAA was on. I think that I might, this is one where I might want to redo it, just to get maybe put it up to 8XAA or MSAA, or maybe even 16, because this one might have been CPU bound a bit more frequently than I would have liked. Hitman, this is one where every game does really well. It's a really well optimized game, and you know, this is an example of, you know, at 1080p 60, almost anything can run Hitman really well. But at 2160p, we're at a point where the Vegas 64 does it pretty well, and the 2080 Ti is almost at a point where you could turn down some settings and get, you know, above 100 frames per second. And then Monster Hunter World. This is one where it's hard. They don't have a benchmark tool, and there's no like replay system like I have with PUBG. So I just this is one where I tried to run a track through the hub world, and it's an intensive game when you have the settings on ultra and you're at 2160p. But again, there's just that huge gap between the 2080 Ti and everything else. And then PUBG. This is another one that was really surprising. I think, you know, that Vegas 64 is doing 30 frames per second. Meanwhile, the 2080 Ti, with just max settings, 60 frames per second at 4K. That is, again, a really cool thing to see. A game that is not known for its performance. 2080 Ti is just up to the challenge. This is another one where we looked at it. I took some the frame line graph here, or the frame rate line graph. I think this one's also over 85 seconds. Yeah, it is. And we did the 2160p, and you can see it's really hovering around 60 frames per second. This is like the one gap here where it's like, okay, it fell low enough, you know, into the 50s and maybe the high 40s there for just a long enough where, okay, you turn down a setting here or there, and we're going to be solidly above 60, no problem, all the time. Again, really cool to see. And then, you know, just to kind of give an example of what we're working with here. If what you care about is 1440p and 144 hertz, here's PUBG running at, you know, again, maxed out settings and staying around 120. It's kind of averages around 120 frames per second. That's really good. And again, all you gotta do is just turn down one or two things, and you're going to be getting above 120 most of the time, and you could probably get to a rock solid 144 if you really wanted to. At a certain point, anything north of 100 frames per second is going to look pretty good on a 144 hertz G-Sync monitor. I believe that does it for the benchmarks that I have right here. I think Shadow. Yeah, okay. So we've been through everything. I think that might. Okay, I guess the thing to talk about is just, yeah, the price. So here's the price for each card. You know, like I said, some of the most powerful and popular cards on the market. And it covers the range that we know about RTX at the moment. So you could see that the 2070 and the 1080, they line up. The 1080 Ti and the 2080, they line up. And the 2080 Ti and the Titan XP, they line up. So comparing the 2080 Ti to a 1080 Ti doesn't make a lot of sense because it's in a whole other price market at this point. It's a whole other segment of the consumer population. And when you start making the dollar to dollar comparison, things fall apart a little bit for Nvidia. It's clear that while the 2080 Ti might be able to justify its price because of its performance relative to the Titan XP, when it comes to something like the 2080, it does feel like some of that money you're paying, that premium you're paying, especially if you go ahead and buy the $800 version, you are paying for the ray tracing and all those tensor cores to handle deep learning, super sampling, and stuff like that. And that's a bit rough, I think. That is where RTX does fall apart, I think, for most people. And it's why I wouldn't recommend it for most people. To feel like you're getting both ray tracing and that huge performance jump, you have to go all the way up to the 2080 Ti, at least for now. And even at $1,000, that's a lot to ask. You know, we talk about how you could build a really good gaming computer for $800 to $1,000 right now. Well, that's a graphics card that costs more than that. That's a tough sell. It's a tough transition. But I think that's what Nvidia wants us to be in, that transition period. And the 2080 Ti is representative of that. But you don't have to go along just because that's what Nvidia wants. You don't. That's not. You know. You just don't have to do that. And I would recommend you probably don't do it. If you can hold off and we see what happens, and let's say ray tracing really does start to pay off really quickly, a lot of this conversation changes. We just don't know if that's the case yet. If ray tracing does come out and it is as big of a game changer as it is, as Nvidia is faking it to be at the moment, then maybe that extra $100, or if the card comes down to $700, the 2080 in this case, that 15% jump or so over the 1080 Ti makes a little bit more sense because, oh, ray tracing is just so much better. It looks so much better. It really does make a difference. But we don't know if that's the case. So until that happens, that 15% jump is a questionable achievement, a questionable gap that I would hold off on plunking my money down just to get that. You know, we'll see what happens with the 2070. Maybe that will make more sense because it's like $50 less than a 1080. We'll see. That could make some sense. But we don't know yet. That card's not in our hands. It's not. We don't know when it's coming out. It is a down the line, still a yet to come thing, just like a lot of things with RTX. Yeah. So I'm trying to think if I have any other final thoughts, because I mean that kind of covers it. You saw the benchmarks. You understand the state of ray tracing. So where are we? Where does that leave us? It leaves us, yeah, we have these cards that don't make a lot of sense. I personally do think Nvidia is going to make ray tracing a thing. It's going to work. It's inevitable, and that'll be great when it happens. For now, though, maybe, yeah, hold off. There's nothing. It's not. You're not going to get hurt. If you absolutely positively have to upgrade your system right now, you have the money, and you're deciding between like a 2080 Ti or a Titan XP, go with the 2080 Ti. If you have a 4K monitor and it's a gorgeous display, you spend all this money on it, and you have plenty of money to spare to get the best graphics card to drive that those millions and millions of pixels, go get a 2080 Ti. It's gonna work for you. It is the best 4K single graphics card that you can get at this point. If you are super duper into topping out your 144 hertz display, maybe go ahead and get a 2080 or a 2080 Ti. Like if you have the money and that's what's important to you, these cards are going to be better at that than anything else right now. But those are the specific use cases and scenarios in which I can think of that I'd be like, yeah, go ahead and get these cards right now. Outside of that, I think we should all probably just pump the brakes and let Nvidia prove itself. You know, I think it will. So what's the harm? If they're going to, then let's just wait for them to do that, and prices could come down, or you'll have more options from third-party vendors. Maybe the prices on the 10 series cards will drop so dramatically that they'll be hard to ignore, and then you benefit in that direction just because you save so much money. There are a lot of scenarios here where just waiting makes sense. But again, I do want to say that doesn't necessarily mean that these cards that they won't make sense in the long run. I think in a year or two, we will be looking back and saying to ourselves, this was the moment when computer graphics changed again for the better. It might not be some huge jump, but it'll probably be important in like the history of this this segment of technology. And even if these specific cards don't take off and they don't last for 6 or 7 years like the GeForce 256 did, I pretty firmly believe that then RTX Gen 2 is going to be it's going to be a big success. I think Nvidia at that point will get cost under control. It'll be able to do a significant performance boost and have all of the benefits of ray tracing and DLSS and everything else without us, with also the content to support having those features so that it's worth the money anyhow. Yeah, that's it's a lot, but I do think that the faking it will lead into the making it, and that's everyone should do it. You should fake it till you make it. I've done it. Nvidia is doing it right now. I'm sure some people are going to look at that and say, "Oh, they're sleazy liars," or "This is just gross marketing." And yeah, I mean, I guess it is that stuff, but I would feel worse about it if we haven't seen Nvidia do this before. If they hadn't done the GeForce 256, but they did. They pulled it off, and it seems so obvious that that's what they're doing again. So yeah, let's let them do it. Doesn't mean you have to go out and spend your money. And like I said, just because I bet that they will make it, I wouldn't bet your money. So yeah, I don't recommend you go out and spend money unless you are sure you need it. For everyone else, let's just wait and see. And who knows? Ray tracing could be the next big thing, and we'll all get there eventually. It's like traffic on the highway. Don't have to go up right on the guy's bumper in front of you. You're not going to be able to go through them. We're all going to get to that light at the same time. We're just going to be waiting there. It'll all be the same. So, yeah, that didn't make any sense. But it's 2:52 a.m. Mountain Time. So, I'm cutting this video, going to bed, I'm posting it, I'm sleeping, in one of those orders. I don't know. I'm not making sense anymore. Goodbye. I love you so much. Goodbye.